talk about female leadership within the ANC. It's taken 95 years for the ANC to reach a 50-50 representation. But would you say that women truly have a space within, or there is a space for women within the upper echelons of the ANC?
I think that there's space for women, but my question has always been what that space translates into. Whether it translates into a different kind of leadership, a transformative, thoughtful leadership, more courageous policy direction, and really a more informed, intuitive way of dealing with societal issues, understanding that there are different experiences and perspectives that our womanhood and our manhood imbue us with. So my question is, what do we do with that space, and how does that influence power and power relations and social relations?
Now, in terms of what you said, right, in terms of creating a space and in terms of power and courage and social relations, one would think that the ANC Women's League would play the largest role in that regard. Do you think that the Women's League really holds weight within the ANC at present?
I think that the ANC Women's League has been steadily losing credibility as a force for gender transformation and any form of anything that resembles feminist thinking for quite a number of generations, really. I suppose the final straw, or the final marking point, was their decision to support the current President Zuma as the preferred presidential candidate, pre-Polokwane, in the midst of, at the time, in the wake of extremely difficult and problematic allegations around sexual impropriety and corruption as well. But I think at the time it was seen as really, really, really problematic by many people in the women's movement and in progressive social movements as well. So I think that in terms of where they stand within the ANC, I'm not sure what their voice is. I have never heard them producing a shadow report or a women's perspective or a gender perspective on anything in particular, whether it's on social planning, whether it's on health and HIV/AIDS, whether it is on public enterprises, any kind of analytical work that would suggest that they're really making an input, and they are really a force to be reckoned with in terms of providing a voice for women's collective concerns in this country.
Very patriarchal country, and we are a country steeped in culture. African culture does dictate that the man does lead and the woman follows. Based on what you've just said, would you say that the ANC Women's League seems to be following those type of cultural dictates? I mean, we've heard some very worrying statements from representatives of the ANC Women's League. Statements like, "We're not competing with men. We're here to work side by side with them, and we're here to support them." So it's almost as though women don't want to be in the forefront of leadership.
I think it's a question of interpretation. I would certainly contest the statement that says that it's African culture that men lead. I think that's quite problematic, I must say. I mean, I think that there are myriad cultures, myriad traditions of leadership, and myriad social arrangements within various African contexts and within the South African context as well. I won't, however, dispute that we have been held hostage to a particular patriarchal framing of power and patriarchal framing of tradition and what it is and is not. And I think that within that, the ANC Women's League has not been able to find, or has not either had the courage of conviction or the imagination or the sort of leadership needed and analytical work needed to begin to rebut those presumptions. I don't have a problem so much with working side by side with men, of course, but I do certainly have a problem with working side by side even when it's at cross purposes and at odds with a progressive women's agenda. And I certainly do have problems working with a fait accompli rather than being a consultative process which is ever cognizant of the need to take on board women's considerations, because our experience spatially, socially, educationally, in terms of our healthcare, in terms of religious values, in terms of our life experience, is very different to that of men. And I think that this is where the debate gets a bit murky, because it is seen as mad feminists with hairy armpits who are man-hating, or the kind of passive, placid woman who stands behind, woman behind the great man syndrome. And I think neither is appropriate. I think really what is appropriate is really the idea that, we're battling for identity politics and citizenship of all layers of society, whether it's women, men, whether it's the elderly, whether it is youth, whether it is whether it is people who are differently abled or physically abled. There are different forms of citizenship that we all need to experience on our own terms. And the Women's League has been extremely weak in articulating women's citizenships and various forms of women's identity and women's needs in this country, and how those are located within the policy space. The ANC Constitution does speak about, women's representativity, 50-50, etc. But my question has always been what the quality of that 50 is, where even when we have achieved
you said it's time for the ANC Women's League to play a greater role. It seems there are some elements within them who do want to break out of that almost subordinate role. In October, the Deputy Chairperson of the Women's League in the Free State said the League does want a 50% female representation in the NEC at Mangaung. And we see that based on their nomination, where they nominated, it's only the Free State which has nominated Baleka Mbete for Deputy President. Do you see this as a symbolic gesture, or is this something which holds some positive weight for the future?
Possibly both. Both maverick, both positive. Baleka Mbete she's been deputy president of the country. I think that in terms of her presence as a party political player, she seems to command a level of respect, and she seems to command a level of gravitas. I think the other woman, prominent woman in the ANC would certainly be Dr. Dlamini Zuma as well. Another would certainly be Miss Naledi Pandor, etc. And to a lesser extent Miss Lindiwe Sisulu. But these are brand names, particularly the last two. I think that the question that Baleka Mbete's nomination by the Free State brings to me is why the ANC Women's League didn't have a list of their own, and why they were not able to influence provincial lists as aggressively or as explicitly as the Free State nomination illustrates is possible. And I think that it would be very useful for the Women's League to have produced their own preferred list of candidates, which is gender sensitive, which has a women's rights agenda, which has a women's development agenda, which is explicit in who is nominated and why. So for me, it speaks to a deeper malaise again within the Women's League, that they don't seem to have a concerted list of women that they feel that they are able to challenge the status quo, or they're not willing really to stick their necks out sufficiently to challenge the status quo. There are lots of strong women, there are lots of competent women. I think what we need is really to be far more imaginative and to look a lot further than the surface, to look beyond the numbers, to look at content, to look at capacity, to look at how we support women in leadership, to look at how we hold each other to account. The same applies, I've said the same about women in industry, women in the corporate sector. How do we hold them account, and how are they accountable to us as women once they reach the upper echelons? And those are the things, the conversations we need to have continuously. And it's a pity that the Women's League is not a very sufficient conduit for those sorts of conversations.
So the question is, why do you think that the ANC Women's League is so unwilling to change, so unwilling to actually move forward and to present themselves as powerful women?
I'm not sure. Possibly because I have no idea. One, I'm not proximate enough to them as a collective. I know, individuals there, but I think that there's a bit of a leadership crisis in terms of the caliber of woman, or the caliber of leader who's able to shift debates a certain direction. I think as well that the caliber of context means that the context has been so personality driven within the ANC right now the last few years, and I think that the Women's League really allowed themselves to become babysitters for the male agenda, particularly by unconditionally supporting the current president during his, the rape trial by unconditionally supporting him as the preferred candidate for president, uncritically, and without really presenting us with any other options. And I think that was very unfortunate. I think that they have lost a lot of credibility in the public domain, particularly amongst younger women, thinking women, women on the ground. We never hear about any debate about what does the Women's League, the ANC women, have to say on any particular issue. So it could be a dearth in their, it could be a symbol of their own leadership crisis, a generational gap as well. I mean, just the need for a new generation of leadership, not only generational in terms of age, but I certainly think generational in terms of thinking, generational in terms of sectors, and generational in terms of, a different way of perceiving and approaching issues. And I think that they've lost a lot of their radicalism, certainly. And I think that it's, the Women's League under Winnie Mandela, who, of course, was always a colorful and controversial character, but you couldn't deny that the League was alive and visible under her leadership, as opposed to now, where it certainly feels more like an appendage or even an addendum to the mainstream agenda of the mother body, the ironically named mother body.
Let's look at 5-10 years from now. You mentioned very strong women like Dr. Dlamini Zuma, like Naledi Pandor. These are women who clearly have made great strides in terms of leadership, and these are women whom I think many South Africans would like to see in more powerful positions. But if these women themselves are not being nominated for NEC positions, for positions within the top 6 in the NEC, what chance do we have for these women to take stronger leadership roles?
I mean, that's a good point. I think it's to do with the institutional commitment, the institution of the ANC party, their commitment, and these things don't happen spontaneously. The leadership development, women's leadership development and ascendancy do not happen, spontaneously. It's like affirmative action. It's like anything. It doesn't happen without commitment, without courage, and without forward thinking and planning. And I think that it's extremely problematic. Well, anybody who says that South Africa is not ready to be led by a woman president, frankly, I'm happy to go on record, to say that they're really delusional and quite really out of touch with the times and the days that we live in. I don't see that I see the election of a woman president in this country as an inevitability. It is inevitable that it will happen. We already have had a deputy president. We had Baleka Mbete acting as deputy president as well after President Beki was recalled. We had Deputy President Phumzile Mlambo Ngcukazi. I mean, we've done this a couple of times already, actually, and they were trusted then among many male cadres to be the ones to step in at very difficult times. I think that we need to be able to trust ourselves as women, and I think the ANC has an obligation to put its 50-50 quota to the limit and really begin to actively canvass and actively groom. And not even grooming, there are women who are ready to rule. I think somebody like President, Dr. Dlamini Zuma is ready to take the highest office. I think somebody like Naledi Pandor. I think that there are many women who are ready to take the highest office. I just think that it's a case of the power dynamics within and the commitment within the institution that is called the ANC coming to a place of commitment and readiness to deal with this inevitability.
And one final question, Lebohang, going to Mangawong, looking again just at those NEC nomination lists. Jesse Duarte, received many nominations for the position of Deputy Secretary General. So do you think that is probably what's going to happen? We see Baleka Mbete as chairperson, Jesse Duarte as Deputy Secretary General, and that plays some role in providing some female representation within the NEC.
Yeah, it's always a tough one, isn't it, between tokenistic, the numbers versus the quality as well. I mean, it's good to see a couple of women there. I think that, I think we should also be careful not to fall into the trap of any woman will do, certainly. I don't think that Jesse Duarte has distinguished herself greatly as a champion of the women's cause by any stretch of the imagination. But my attitude to her would be, well, why not? I mean, there's certainly a number of unsavory corruption charges against her when she was still MEC here in Gauteng. But those are personality issues. Those are to do with the credibility and the integrity of any leader. And I would hold a man to the same standards as well. That's the thing about leadership as a principle. What kind of leaders in principle are we looking for? And I think the concern that I certainly have had is across the board is the kind of recycling that has taken place under the Zuma administration of, characters who left under a cloud or were very angry at the former president, or, people who are recycled and of not very great astuteness or great leadership prowess or anything in particular, and are certainly not necessarily principled choices, it seemed like at the time, but, a bit of a ragtag of an anti-Mbeki lobby more than anything. And I'm hoping that there's enough of time that has elapsed for greater sobriety and greater circumspection in the broad platform of leaders that we choose, women and men.